It's wonderful to see you. It's kind of crazy to be back in person at an event, you know? I sort of like it. Human beings, warm bodies, bookstores. Could get used to this kind of thing. So I'm Deepak Bhargava. I'm one of the co-editors of the book, and the format for tonight is we're each going to talk just very briefly about some of the ideas that are in the book, and then we're hoping to have a conversation with you about some of them and take your questions. A little bit of the backdrop for the book is it was conceived and written and put together in the Trump years. And we finished writing it in August of 2020, right? Yeah. So not knowing what the results of the election would be. But our idea was that for the Trump years, the immigrant rights movement had to be largely on defense. We were really focused on all the things that we opposed, and that we needed to articulate a vision of what we were for. What is our vision of an immigration system that we really believe in and embrace, that's in line with our values, and an immigration system that's part of a larger vision for economic and racial justice in the country? So that was kind of the goal, and we went looking for ideas, bold ideas, in the academy for sure, and we found some there, and also in movements. And what we saw was that under the radar screen, people were coming up with new solutions to really big questions. What to do about climate change and how it is impacting migration flows. Who should be allowed to come to the United States in the future, and what migration levels should be in the next 10 and 20 years. What should our refugee policy be? What should our enforcement policy be? And we also had pieces in the book that really talked about organizing and political and movement strategy. So not just what's the world we want to build, but what's the real path to get there? And so these included contributions on things like how states in the country move from being red to blue because of deliberate, conscious organizing efforts over many years and cycles by immigrant-led organizations. Included stories you'll hear about tonight about the immigrant youth movement and the distinctive contribution it's made to reframing how the country thinks about immigrants and their role. To another piece about the role of corporations and how immigrant rights needs to be situated in an analysis of capitalism and class. So those were some of the goals for the book, and I know I'm a little biased, but I think it's a pretty amazing collection of visionary essays that stand the test of time, and I hope will be kind of a roadmap for 10 and 20 years for the movement. My own piece in the book, and then I'll transition to Ruth, really focused on trying to imagine what happens after we win legalization for 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country. And I do believe that will happen. This conversation is happening at a momentous time when that's unfolding right before our eyes, and some of the folks here are in the middle of that, so hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about it. But the idea for my own chapter was that we needed a vision for future migration, and that we need to prepare to welcome millions more people to the United States for humanitarian reasons, for economic reasons, taking into account diversity, for family migration. All the pathways need to be expanded, and we need to build a social movement in this country to welcome millions of more people to our shores, or we will continue to see the kind of horrible human rights crises unfold at the southern border and the interior that are unfolding today, that we have an affirmative responsibility and the opportunity to build a just and humane immigration system for the 21st century. So with that, I'm first going to turn this over to my colleague and co-editor of the book, Ruth Milton.
Thanks, Deepak, and thanks everyone for being with us. It is so exciting to be in a room instead of a Zoom with all of you. So, I just want to add a couple general points about the book, and then I'll tell you a little bit about my own contribution to it. What Deepak said is obviously true that we prepared this during the last year of the Trump administration. Actually, we did, when we were doing the final corrections, we knew that Biden had won the election, so we made a few changes in the tenses of several sentences, Trump was, like that kind of thing. And then this edition, the paperback, has a new introduction that just kind of summarizes some things that have happened since Biden came in. So just so you know. And another emphasis in the book, partly because of who we are, you heard in the introductions that both Penny and I, and now Deepak, are part of the School of Labor and Urban Studies at CUNY. There's a lot of labor stuff in this book. So there, I'll just mention a couple examples. So for some of the chapters, we ended up doing interviews, since there were activists who weren't in the habit of writing essays for such publications. And so we did interviews and then edited them and included them. So there's one with a real hero of the immigrant rights movement and the labor movement, Eliseo Medina. Some of you will know who that is, who is actually retired now from SEIU, but was previously in the United Farm Workers. Anyway, it's a lovely interview of the trajectory of labor movement involvement in immigrant rights. And at the beginning, not such positive involvement, and then how it evolved. And also there's an interview with Dee Taylor, who's currently the international president of the Hotel and Restaurant Workers Union, Unite Here it's now called. But before he became president, worked in Las Vegas and at the Culinary Workers Union, which is one of the largest sorry, I keep calling it the old name since I'm old. One of the oldest and largest locals in that union, and he writes, his interview is all about how Nevada was politically transformed by the mobilizations of immigrants that the culinary led. So there's a lot of interesting labor stuff. And I'll just say briefly about my own chapter, which is not an interview, but makes an argument about also labor-based, which is this. I start with what many people call the immigrant threat narrative that Trump trumpeted, the idea that immigrants are a threat to the white working class, and for that matter, the black working class, to the US-born working class, that they take jobs away from quote-unquote American workers, and you've all heard this a million times, as well as, raise crime rates, destroy American culture, et cetera. I attack the jobs piece of that narrative by trying to show that the history is sort of the opposite of what that narrative implies, arguing that in many industries, the sequence of events is the following. First, employers degrade jobs, destroy unions, take away benefits, all the rest of it. You know that story. And they do that in industries that were populated often by white US-born men. Think of residential construction or trucking, for example. In some cases, it was people of color, but US-born, who were unionized and who had so-called middle-class jobs that, paid decent wages, had benefits, all the rest of it. When those jobs are degraded and become undesirable, those workers abandon them. I'm not doing this under these terms, when they're used to something better. If they possibly could, many abandon them. And after that is when employers start recruiting immigrants to replace them. So US-born workers have, I argue, every reason to be enraged by this sequence of events, but they should be directing their rage not at immigrants, but at employers and the policymakers who enable the growth of skyrocketing inequality, et cetera. So that's what my chapter is. And there's a lot more that we don't have time to tell you about, so check out the book. Who's next? Daniel. Sure. Oh, you prepared.
I'm gonna use notes. You guys do it all memory. Not my bad.
There you go.
Daniel, you might want to put it like
Yes.
more. Yeah.
Hi, everyone.
Oh, wow.
Thank you to Deepak, to Penny, and to Ruth for the invitation, and for the invitation to participate in this really phenomenal volume. I will share that I'm teaching the book to students this semester, and they found it to be a really invaluable resource to understand both the history of immigration policy and organizing in this country, and also to think about where we are now and what a way forward is. So I think it's a really important contribution, and if you haven't read it, highly encourage it. buy several copies today. You will not be disappointed. I'm here on behalf of, there were 4 of us who wrote a chapter from Make the Road New York. Javier, who's here, Javier Valdez, Deborah Axt, and Angeles Solis. They would probably do a more compelling job of telling the story of our chapter than me, but you're stuck with me nonetheless. I think just a couple minutes on what we were arguing. Our chapter is focused on corporate complicity in the immigrant detention and deportation pipeline, and the importance of taking it on directly, confronting it directly. And we focused, well, I think where we started is to note that the immigration debate usually in this country, when we talk about politics, it focuses on the Beltway, focuses on DC lawmakers, what they're going to do, who can we move, how can we move them, and that stuff really matters. It matters. We're a membership-based organization, Make the Road New York, of immigrants whose futures are at stake based on this debate. Less focus has been paid to the role of corporate actors, both in how the system that they're a part of devastates immigrants, and also how companies are profiting from it and pushing for its continuation and expansion. And so in the Trump era, we knew that we had to take on, the defensive posture that Deepak was talking about earlier from the Trump administration, because we knew that they were going to try myriad things during the course of that administration to cause more misery, suffering, and the separation of immigrants from their loved ones. But we also knew that to achieve these goals, he needed private actors and corporations to scale up that detention and deportation infrastructure. And while he was not going to respond, and his administration was not going to respond positively to us saying, stop doing that. I mean, we were going to organize and try to throw sand in the gears of all the horrible policy things that they were trying to do in Washington, that it was important to try to make it, frankly, painful for corporate actors to play that role. So we launched a campaign with our allies called the Corporate Backers of Hate, and we launched it in 2017. And what we focused on was we had these private detention companies that you've probably heard of, GEO and CoreCivic, who do the lion's share of private immigrant detention. They themselves were not going to be very receptive to our appeals to stop doing their bread and butter business. But we identified the role of banks who were critical in this sector because of the dependence of these companies on debt financing. And so we launched this campaign in 2017 to go after the banks that were financing this private detention. And I think the campaign was exciting and transformative, and in the chapter we talk about the role of creative direct action, of having we had our members who had experienced private detention, the horrors of detention, speaking up outside of JP Morgan Chase headquarters, outside of Jamie Dimon's house, and a rolling series of actions that frankly made this company's lives, these folks, kind of miserable, which was the point, of course, and shamed them. And I think ultimately, well, I'll tell you, the good news is we won, or we won some very important victories. Some key things that work that I think are important as we look forward are, one, leading with the stories of those who are directly affected. I mean, this was a really intersectional focus. For instance, we had a number of our trans members who'd experienced the particular horrors of being detained in a GEO or CoreCivic facility as a trans immigrant. And I think those stories lent moral authority to the work that we were doing. We led with a bold demand and with confrontational and creative tactics that told a compelling story. The first action was civil disobedience outside of the JP Morgan Chase headquarters. Some people who got arrested in that action may or may not be in this room with us this evening. Leading to, when the company wouldn't respond, marching to Jamie Dimon's house, first with the ProPublica audio that had been released from detention centers in the South. And then later we went back with Mariachi Band to demand that Jamie Dimon break up with the private detention companies. It was a big tent campaign that went beyond immigrant rights groups, and that was really important for the work that we were doing. And I think one thing that maybe isn't necessarily in the muscle memory of all of our movement is we invested in research, corporate research, and understanding how these companies were doing business, looking in the Bloomberg terminal, and then publishing research so that the information that journalists were going to on these issues was at least in part coming from us. We won a huge and frankly previously unimaginable victory. First, we got JP Morgan Chase to pledge to not renew its financing of private detention of these companies. We got Wells Fargo very soon thereafter, and there was a domino effect where in the end we had 9 banks representing almost all the financing in this sector pledging not to renew. Just to fast forward, and I'm looking forward to the conversation, I think one thing, if you read the hardcover, I highly recommend the paperback. There's a new preface that's really good, and I think does nice updating that you weren't able to do perhaps in August of 2020. And one of the campaigns that it highlights is the Fund Excluded Workers campaign that our members worked on. Angeles Solis, who couldn't be here, helped to lead this effort. And I think we drew in this effort, which was about identifying undocumented folks who had been excluded from all relief, who were said, hailed as essential workers and then excluded from all federal and state relief, demanding New York State tax the wealthiest New Yorkers to fund excluded workers. And this campaign, I think, drew a number of the lessons of what had worked in the Corporate Backers of Hate campaign, really focused on naming and shaming the bad guys who were cashing in while others suffer, people like Jeff Bezos, for instance, centering the stories and needs, especially in a moment of crisis, in this case in the pandemic, leaning into bold and creative action, and really just highlighting inequality, economic inequality, and I think you noted this, the way in which class and the deep flaws of our capitalist system are connected to the experiences of immigrants. So with that, maybe I'll leave it there and we could talk more about where we are right now a bit later. Thanks, everybody.
It's so wonderful to be here. Hi, everyone. Christina. This is like my first event in person, so I have to say I have all the feels, and it's so wonderful to actually start this way. So first, I just want to share gratitude for all the work that you led, Deepak and Ruth and Benny, and bringing a whole bunch of busy people under the Trump era to write about our work or to have interviews. And I agree. I think it's an amazing collection of voices and vision and analysis from our movement that hasn't actually been captured before in this way. So I'm really grateful for it and totally recommend it. So get lots of coffee for the holidays, and, all the gifts, all the Christmas shopping. I will say, I think that we're in such a juicy moment because there's so much about what's in the book that connects to the conversation that we're having on immigration and many other issues in the country and in Washington. But I will say what is relevant about the chapter that I worked on. And it's really about the role of people impacted, as Daniel was saying, in building movement, in leading campaigns, and the particular role that young immigrants played in the early 2000s, like myself and many others. And it's so wonderful to see Isabel here from Florida, another pioneer of the immigrant youth movement, who, really put everything on the line because it was about our lives and about our families. And it was very much shaped by 9/11. And, we just went through the 20-year honoring of the lives that were lost. But also for me, it was an acknowledgement of the war on immigrants that got intensified in 9/11. And as a result of the shaping of 9/11 and the increased attacks on communities, you saw the resistance also intensifying. And this is where many of us in immigrant communities started to just see people disappearing because of deportation. And so many of the campaigns that I got involved in at the beginning were related to stopping the deportations of our friends and loved ones, which ultimately really created a shift in the conversation about immigrants, a shift in how we were doing movement and advocacy work and organizing. Because for the first time, you saw young, undocumented folks out there, not only sharing their stories, but also fighting, building power, organizing, and winning campaigns. And doing what was, unconventional at the time, which was to actually stop deportations. And I want to start there because part of what I raise in the book is the need to have audacious and visionary people from our communities not only call a thing and, talk about the white supremacist and racist and anti-Black history that has shaped the country, our systems, our laws, including the immigration system, but also to be the visionaries of what are the kinds of policies and country that we want to build together. And, I wouldn't say that I started there when I started organizing and when I joined my first deportation campaign here in New York. But as the movement grew, it wasn't just sharing our stories as undocumented and confronting the country with the humanity of the debate as opposed to focusing on the illegals that are stealers and takers, job takers, et cetera, as Ruth was sharing. But that we were also human beings. But beyond that, it was about building power and telling a story and a vision that was compelling for allies, immigrants, non-immigrants alike to join our movement of a country where all of us could belong, regardless of where we come from, race, color, background. And I think in that effort, a vision for a country and a system without ICE really emerged. And, I really wanted to take the opportunity of my chapter to lift up that fighting against deportations and even envisioning something like abolishing ICE really came from communities of color, immigrants, Black, brown immigrants, particularly Muslim groups that saw the impact of 9/11 policies. And at the time, right after 9/11, these were kind of like fringe visions, right? Like no one thought that we could really abolish ICE. So let's not talk about that. Why don't we talk about citizenship? That's not to say that, citizenship doesn't matter or one is better than the other, but we need all of it. And what was important for me was to lift up that some of those visions and those demands that may have been considered fringe at the time, really under the Trump era, I think, exposed, it was kind of unveiling what many people in this country had not seen. And that is just how this deportation machine had been intentionally built to go after people of color. And its connections, as Daniel was breaking down, to mass incarceration and corporations that are profiting from Black and brown bodies. So I think the way that it connects to now, that I want to close with this, is that Biden ran on an agenda and a vision to be more humane on immigration, right? To be the opposite to what Trump was promoting in terms of his policy and his vision. And I want to be clear that I don't believe they're the same. They are not. And at the same time, some of the Trump policies remain in place. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, under the Biden administration, we saw Border Patrol agents whipping Haitian refugees at the border. And this is not the first time that this happens, but people caught this in camera and, it became more visible. But that's just to say that unless this administration or future administrations and Congress and us as people of this country, unless we confront the role that white supremacy and anti-Blackness and racism has played in shaping who we are as a country, our culture, our politics, our systems and institutions, we're really not gonna get at the solutions that we need. And this is why you saw a Biden administration struggling to message. How do you talk about what happened at the border? Well, it was the horses, we're gonna ban the horses. It wasn't about the horses. It was about a corrupt, rogue agency that was actually modeled after a slave patrol. And some of the first members of Border Patrol were KKK members. So I think that for me, what I'm really hopeful about is a lot of the visions and the conversations in the book are relevant for the conversation now, but also to continue to push us and challenge us to dream bigger and to do the work that we need to do to build a truly inclusive country.
Thank you so much, Christina and Daniel and Ruth and Deepak. I'm Penny, the third editor on the book, and I'll just say that it was an incredible honor to work both with my colleagues, but also with all the fantastic contributors to this book. I think you've gotten a little glimpse of the depth of experience and analysis and strategic thinking that all of our writers brought to the contributions that they made, and now we have a fantastic opportunity for you all to ask any questions or make any observations, and my colleagues up here can respond. So, did you want us to pass around the mic, or?
No, I can just hold the mic up to someone if they want to say, you know, like, so they can be heard, you know. So, yeah, this one is, no, this one's not on. There we go. Okay, so, and it hasn't been used yet, so you can tell me and I take it to someone and they can.
So,
I can put my mask back on.
over here.
Oh, hi.
I was like, do I need a microphone?
You might not need a mic, yeah.
It would help for the
Oh, it'd be,
video.
I'll put it
That's
on.
okay.
I'll do it. I haven't got that well.
I think I would love to hear from you all. We are in this moment where there is a quote unquote labor shortage. And given that being, you know, the core of the Trump argument, would love to hear proactively as we're looking to the midterms, as like we're just organizing in general and having these conversations. If there's something that you wish is included in the narrative that you think that we need to be doing, particularly amongst, and for those of us that organize immigrant workers, would love to hear.
Thanks, and also if everyone could identify themselves, because we could all meet each other, which is such a nice opportunity.
Good afternoon, I'm Isabel. I'm from Brooklyn. I don't know how much what else you would like to know.
Are you from CUNY? That's what we're gonna know if you're from CUNY.
And we'll take a couple of questions at once so that we have some choices. Yeah.
Absolutely. Does anyone else have a question? I have a question. I was wondering how you all organize the different contributors. Like there was a lot of outreach to people that maybe you'd worked with before, but some other people that I don't know, like I noticed Representative Jayapal hasn't, her article is in there. So I'd wonder if you speak to that a little bit, how that was organized.
Sure, I'll start. I don't really know the answer about the labor shortage, but I've been thinking about how that is like a silence in the conversation about how we don't have enough workers for restaurants and so on. It's sort of obvious that immigrants used to do those jobs. Agriculture is a more extreme example, where the growers are complaining that, you know, immigration policy is screwed up and that's why they don't have any workers. It's a tricky argument to make in the public sphere. Here we're among friends, so I feel fine saying it, but I'm not really sure. The longer term though, I think you can make a very compelling case when you think about the aging of the population, for example, and the incredible demand already for home care workers and so on, as well as for lifting up their paying conditions, of course. But that's an obvious place where immigrants could fill a real need that every single person in this country is likely, if they survive that long, is likely to face. So, you know, but I think it's a little tricky because what we also want to do is lift up the standards for those jobs so that they're good jobs for all. And so, you know, it's just hard to know how to navigate all that, but I think it's a great question. You should answer about Pramila, et cetera. Let me just say one more thing, which is that we were planning this originally as a live conference. Pre-pandemic, we started planning it. We raised some money we were going to have. So it ended up being a webcast. But where is she? So when we were recruiting people, it was you who asked that question. That was the original intention, but then we never were able to do it until tonight.
Well, there you are. Now you're here.
Yeah, to me, one of the interesting things about the economic question is the new census data came out that showed this pattern of aging of the country, and that in the 2060s there'll be 2 active workers for every retiree. Which, if you compare that to the 60s, it was 6 workers for every retiree. 2 to 1 is not an economically sustainable ratio for Social Security, for Medicare, for anything. So that's one argument. The book says, well, that's legitimate, and there are many other arguments for increasing immigration too. So we want to look at immigrants not only for their economic contributions, which are substantial, but also in their full humanity. And there's kind of the beginning of an argument, which I think is pretty important, about understanding the historical roots of migration. So why are people coming from the Northern Hemisphere countries, from Haiti, et cetera? Some of that has to do with climate change, hurricanes, floods, and droughts that were not substantially caused by the residents of those countries. Some of that has to do with US foreign policy, which has increased exploitation and oppression in those countries over many decades. So there's like an argument on economic grounds, on moral grounds, and humanitarian grounds as a form of kind of reparations for the harm that the United States has done in particularly Central America and the Caribbean. And I think that's important because we're going to see more and more crises like what has just exploded into public view. And the argument, yes, is important about how immigrants contribute to the economy, but there's going to have to be a deeper kind of moral reckoning on immigration as the country is beginning to have a reckoning on race. You know, I've been thinking lately, and Christina has mentioned it, we need a 1619 Project equivalent. That's the immigration story about the generations and generations that have kind of led us to the patterns that we see unfolding now, that's a key part of the project as well. In terms of the participation, so, really the effort was to look for new and original paradigms and to be kind of neutral about where they came from. So some come from academia, a lot come from movement actors. And Pramila Jayapal really was a movement actor, is a movement actor, not just a member of Congress. So in a way, she's kind of an exceptional figure. Her origin story is in the immigrant rights movement. So that was kind of the selection process, was to find those ideas regardless of where they were coming from.
I too would sidestep maybe the labor shortage question, which I think is really thorny. But I think one thing that's covered in one of the chapters of the book that is a really big shift discursively and in terms of kind of rhetorical power on our side is this idea of essential workers. And I think it's something that immigrant rights organizations have leaned into. So I mentioned the case of excluded workers, right? On the one hand, you're saying you're championing us as the people working on the front lines and home health aides and delivery workers, et cetera. And on the other hand, you're leaving us out. And there's been a particular potency, I think, to the point that in the conversation around, I imagine we'll talk a bit more around the debate right now around legalization and the path to citizenship, the category of essential workers is something that has become a core category alongside much longer established categories in this debate, DACA recipients, temporary protected status recipients, farm workers. So, I think the jury's still out about how long that term or concept or notion and valuing people and their work in this way will continue. We can't predict the future, but I do think it's something that in this moment has resonance and, organizations and movement groups have tried to lean into.
And we have another question here. What's your question?
Hi, I'm Ellen. I'm just wondering why sidestep? I mean, let's hear it.
Do you want to take more? I'm simply saying it's a challenging question. I think for the reasons that Ruth is sharing, I don't think it's an immediately obvious answer how to capitalize it, but it certainly merits more discussion.
So I see Jean in the back.
Here you go.
Thank you. My name is Gene Carroll. I'm an adjunct faculty member at CUNY SLU and just retired as director of the Union Leadership Institute at Cornell. So I have a question, but prefaced by a brief comment. I just finished, a week ago, reading the autobiography of Samuel Gompers for the first time, which was edited by Cornell professor Nick Salvatore about 25 years ago. And his introduction is just phenomenal if you want a critique of Gompers, but the thing that jumps out at me, Gompers had many admirable qualities, but I'll tell you what, if, in today's world, if he was advocating on the issue of immigration, and today he would be a Trump supporter. And his position, I mean, I wrote in the margin many times, like, wow, you motherfucker. And he would talk about Chinese coolies. Repeatedly, he would talk about, the immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe who are difficult to, quote unquote, Americanize workers. And he was blaming the economic conditions that accrue because of a huge immigration on the workers themselves, when in fact, as we know, the exploding industrial democracy, so-called, of America at the time was relying on this influx of immigrant workers. And there was, in the 19th century, 43 million workers came to the United States in the 19th century. I think it was around 43 million. In any event, the question is, do you have a insight onto what the current AFL-CIO policy is on immigration? And because I know it's a little better now than it was when Samuel Gompers was the president, thank goodness. But I'm just wondering if any of you have an insight on that question. I don't. Thank you.
Jean, thanks for that question. I'm wondering, again, if there are any other folks who want to throw stuff out before I give it back. I see Samir here, yeah, thanks.
All right, here we go.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Samir. I also teach at the School of Labor and Studies with Deepak, Penny, and Ruth. So this is great. I just should say that this is the first time I've been at an event, and it's really lovely to be here with all of you and talking about this subject. A thing I've been thinking about a lot lately is this challenge, and I've ranted about this to some of my colleagues, is this challenge that we're facing right now on the left of, the imperative of long-term movement building, which is always an imperative, with the simultaneous imperative of basically avoiding fascism, like next November. Liberals across this, liberals are paying attention to this right now and are thinking about it too, and it's notable. And what's striking is that this is something that people in the immigrant rights movement have been thinking about for a long time. It's a reality of the movement forever. And so I guess I'm wondering, and I've been trying to think about this. The climate movement is another kind of example where you see a similar dynamic of, like, we've got this structural big thing that we need to do, but we also have to stop burning carbon today. And so, we've got the structural thing about reforming the immigration system, but we've also got to stop this deportation today. And so, I guess I'd be interested in just hearing us talk about how we can use experience from the movement to think about what we're all up against now.
Thank you. Thanks.
Great, and why don't we hear one more comment, question from the audience, thanks.
Hi, I'm Isabel.
A little closer on the mic.
I'm the program officer at the Edward Hazen Foundation, and similar to that, one of the things that stands out about the book is that you've got organizers, you've got academics, you've got government officials all talking about the different pieces and how they fit together. And so I'm curious what you would say about the alignment between, and I know, Christina, you're in positions of leadership in philanthropy as well, and I'm in philanthropy. So about what are some of the lessons of the strategic alignment between these different sectors for the work ahead, and what's missing from that type of alignment and strategic collaboration that is necessary between organizers, academics, government officials, philanthropy to move the work forward.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for these really rich questions. I wonder, Ruth, you might want to start with the AFL.
With Jean's question,
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, that's my bread and butter, I guess, that question. Yeah, you're right about Gompers, though. Ironically, he was an immigrant himself, you might recall, from Germany. So, and actually in the early 20th century, immigrants were overrepresented relative to their numbers in the population among union leaders, interestingly. So there's a lot of fun facts here. But yeah, you're right. He was, he, and not just he, but the labor movement more generally, actively campaigned for the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. That was the reality. And in more recent times, labor's record is pretty mixed, especially in the 20th century as opposed to the 21st. The turn of the century was actually a key moment in that history. Even now, there are some unionists who are see immigrants as a threat in the way I was describing earlier. Look, so, and the history in general of the labor movement is this kind of vacillation between inclusion and exclusion. The same thing happened with women workers 100 years ago, as some of you know. So the choice is kind of, are you gonna try to keep, try to preserve the hard-won victories for the few that you've already organized, white men typically, especially in the early 20th century. More lately, it's much more even gender-wise, and try to keep people out of the jobs that you have done that with, which is what Gomper's approach was, and what many, to this day, some of the building trades unions have that approach. Or is your strength as a labor movement going to come from organizing everybody, whoever the boss hires, essentially, right? And it's also tangled up with questions of craft versus industrial versus service unionism, of course, which we don't have time for tonight, but Jean, you know all that. So by the end of the 20th century, a shift has happened in the AFL-CIO, which has then included some of the unions that have later left, right? And partly because of very successful immigrant organizing, some of which is mentioned in these pages. The iconic case being the Justice for Janitors campaign, which I bet most people here are familiar with, but there were others as well, that kind of showed that, contrary to the belief of some union leaders, you could organize immigrants. In fact, it seemed like they were more interested in being organized when given the opportunity, which didn't happen often enough, but it did happen, than US-born workers who were more individualistic often, whatever. So once that was demonstrated, which happened mostly on the West Coast, but got to the attention of the union bureaucracy or whatever you want to call it, they began to shift. And by 2000, the AFL-CIO did a 180-degree turn and made a public announcement that they supported immigrant rights and that they wanted to organize immigrant workers and so on. And whoever wasn't on board then, after those massive immigrant rights marches of 2006 that some of you probably were part of and remember, I remember them vividly. I was in LA then, which was transformed from a car-dominated city to a pedestrian-dominated city briefly. It was really quite amazing. But so then anybody who didn't realize that immigrants could organize, by that time it was so obvious and you started to see more movement in that direction. I have to say, in the period since the Great Recession, it's been a lot quieter on the labor front, sadly. But in terms of official positions, it's now, labor is essentially part of the immigrant rights community and alliance, and some unions are very, very strongly involved in that. So that's the happy ending to that story. Well, I've got the floor. Let me say a teeny bit about the fascism question, though. I think Deepak is really our expert on that. Look, I think our view in the book, what we try to argue in the book, is that this question, immigration, is totally central to preventing that from happening. In other words, like the liberal Democrats who embrace the kind of immigrant threat narrative, which some do, on occasion, Hillary Clinton, for example, has done so. In Europe, you see that all the time among people who call themselves, leftists or whatever. That's just a hopeless quest. You're never going to outdo the right on that front, A. And the only way for us to win is to bring together all the communities that, do support democracy and inclusion. And demographically, if you just look at the numbers, that means we have to organize everyone, people of color, white people who are on our side, et cetera, and, fight for voters' rights and all the rest of it. And I think, actually, the D. Taylor chapter I mentioned before sort of shows the way forward in a way, because Unite Here has actually it started, I have to say, as a former LA person, I have to say, this strategy began in Los Angeles earlier, but unions have shown that once you start organizing immigrants as workers, you can also encourage those who are eligible for naturalization to become citizens, encourage those citizens to register to vote, get them to turn out at the polls. That's what the culinary did in Las Vegas. That's what Miguel Contreras, no longer with us, did in LA and turned it into a, really transformed the politics of LA and later California as a whole. You were part of, Samir, as you know, of course, the Unite Here efforts in the election we just went through last November, which also made a huge difference along similar lines. So that's the only way forward, in my view. And I know Deepak has much more to say on this topic, so let me pass the mic to you.
Yeah, I thought we asked for softball questions. These are some pretty profound questions. Yeah, I think the short-term, long-term question, I was reflecting when Christina was talking about all these deportation struggles that we waged. And my first one was a We Are Marie campaign for a young woman, Marie Gonzalez from Missouri, that totally transformed me and everybody who was involved in it, I think. But one of the things I feel like I learned from that is you can fight that kind of battle in a way that mobilizes people who already agree with you, or as a battle that recruits people into the cause. And it's actually a choice. You actually have to make the choice of, do you fight the short-term crisis as though you're just kind of leaving all these other people aside? And in that case, there were conservative, evangelical Christians in her hometown who came to her defense, and we had to welcome in. And so every one of these short-term battles, I feel like the recruitment mentality. So that's only part of the answer to that question. I think there's got to be front and center. And I'm not sure I always did a great job of it, or that we always do a great job of it, but that's what I kind of left with from that case. And then to Isabel's question, so I feel a very high degree of frustration about the relationship between the party, the Democratic Party, and movements. Now, that's zero frustration with Pramila Jayapal, who's kind of modeling what it looks like to have a movement person in a position of power. But, we're sort of at this critical moment where people will either see and feel that the movement's demands over many years are being reflected back in delivery in a way that creates a virtuous cycle of more movement, more voting, more participation, or we don't. And it feels like such a fraught moment. And if there's one thing I could change, right, it's like on the right, this works very differently. The relationship between the outside movements and the political establishment, and we're not quite getting it right. And it really worries me, because I think we're in trouble next year unless this resolves properly. Last thing is just, I'm not an academic. Turns out there's a lot of useful stuff in academia and movements that we don't make use of. So that would be my two. Lots more to say about that, but it's embarrassing how much I didn't know. So.
Well, it's 8 o'clock, so if you want to answer a few more questions, but I want to make sure that we get time. We've got 6 people here that can sign books. So
I want to make sure Daniel and Christina get
yes,
shot in.
yeah, you get a closing, and and we've got the books, and people will sign in the back corner, and then you pay on your way out. So, sure.
I think I just want to build on a few things that some folks have already mentioned. Isabel, your question made me think about how does the inside-outside game look like? And I think part of the frustration with the party also, and just also that as a movement, we are getting better at building power, running our own folks for office, winning those elections and holding folks accountable when they're in office, and really building that muscle of governing. Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't say that we're really good at it yet. And so the result of that is that, one, we don't have a lot of folks from the movement that are in the inside. Congresswoman Jayapal, I think it's a big exception. And even when you look at staff positions, people who are staffing the president, people who are, the key advisors on immigration, they're none of our people. None of the folks that have worked on the issue, none of the folks that have come from movements. And it's actually, a lot of operatives that come from prior administrations, Obama, Clinton, et cetera. So it's much harder to do that kind of alignment when we don't have our folks also on the governing side. And what I have seen is that when we do have folks, it works. I mean, I think Daniel can talk a lot about that here in terms of, getting champions and folks from our movements elected into city council and the state, and how that has led to things like driver's licenses in the state, et cetera. Obviously with the pressure of movements, but I think this is not just on immigration, so I don't want to isolate that, we don't have like good immigration people. It's just across the sector and across movements. So I think that's just a pressing urgency that in the short term, like, we have to disrupt electorally, and that has to continue. And then I think that to the bigger question about, and this touches a little bit on both like the labor movement, but also like what it's going to happen, right? Like, these QAnon people are going to be running for office. They may be winning some congressional seats. I'm freaking out. I know a lot of us are. And so I think for me, that means that what doesn't change is the urgent need to organize, and to organize everyone that we can. And the reality is that despite the work of labor, we had labor unions, which has been tremendous, with its flaws and the successes, is that this country doesn't have a working class movement. We don't have a strong working class movement that is multiracial, that it's inclusive. And I really think that we need that kind of multiracial working class movement to disrupt not only the economy and how it works, but also institutions, culture, conversation. And quite frankly, like the power is going to be in the numbers, and we are the majority. So it's not just, labor unions get it together, like, let's organize more people. Like, it's all of us really doing the work to organize and to fight against authoritarian regimes. Because immigration everywhere, not only here, but in every other authoritarian regime, it's one of the central elements of how these regimes build power. And, I don't want us to be only freaking out, but it is disappointing to see the Biden administration feeling like they need to cave in to the far right wing and white supremacists who really want some of the same on immigration that we saw under Trump. And I often wonder, what kind of voters are they thinking about? It's is this myth of the swing voter a real thing? Do they really think that they're going to move people? So I think that, that for me just creates the urgency for the kind of organizing that we need to do for the longer term and the shorter term.
It's very confusing with the mask of the microphone. A couple things. I think one, the electoral organizing piece is really crucial. I think the immigrant rights movement has gotten substantially better. I mean, if Deepak thinks about what it looked like in the mid 2000s in terms of kind of C4 or electoral infrastructure to where we are now, it is leaps and bounds different. And so there is a muscle in the movement that was not there before. And yet there's a long way to go. There's dramatic underinvestment, I think, frankly, in even the organizations that are doing this the best, for where resources are going elsewhere, right? And even last year, organizations like Lucha in Arizona that were doing amazing work, and the Democratic Party was at least from somebody who I spoke to recently who went to organize there, it was the first time that in that part of the state they'd ever even thought about in the party a Latinx outreach effort. So I think there's a long way to go. I think on the plus side, to your point about how it can be different, and maybe to end on an optimistic note, and we've seen this with Representative Jayapal and what it looks like to have not just somebody connected to immigrant rights, but an organizer who is organizing people in Congress and changing outcomes. In New York, I mentioned the Fund Excluded Workers campaign, which was something where we won this historic, unthinkable $2.1 billion fund for undocumented people in New York. A dramatic state-level expansion of the safety net that I can't think of a parallel, at least a recent parallel. And part of that was this incredible organizing led by our members and allies and taking to the streets and being confrontational. And part of it was many of our organizations, sister political organizations, had elected some truly remarkable state legislators. And we lost the governor's race in 2018. Like, we have not yet, and there's a real difference between electing legislators and electing executives. But Andrew Cuomo was still there. And yet, with this scrappy band of movement supported and boosted new elected officials, we had an inside-outside game, and people really punching from the inside of I'm going to mix my metaphors and like punching from the inside of the belly of the beast or something, that really had a transformative impact and led to transformative policy change. So that is not, I don't think that gets us to stopping fascism once and for all in 2021 or 22 necessarily. But I think as we continue to build those numbers, we'll do better. And I know, at least for us, like, we're definitely thinking about already very carefully about what do we do in Senate and House races as we move into 2022, because there is so much at stake and we can't afford demobilization, electoral demobilization.
I think we wrap up. Organize, run for office, and buy the book.
Thank you.